In 2019, a man with 3 passports left the country inside a musical instrument box. It wasn't an ordinary man. It was the Lebanese billionaire Carlos Ghosn, the CEO of the Japanese company Nissan. How can a man of such high social status escape in this way? What prompted him to escape? Who planned for such a genius escape plan? Today's story is about Carlos Ghosn. You might have heard of this name in the past few years because his story is widely known. Carlos Ghosn is a man of Lebanese origins and has 3 nationalities: Lebanese, French, and Brazilian. After his graduation in France, he got an administrative job at Michelin, a well-known French car tire company. Carlos was a hard worker. He kept getting promoted until he became the chief of the American division of Michelin, which is considered a highly esteemed position. Since Michelin was a French company, it had a strong relationship with Renault, the biggest French car company at the time. The CEO of Renault heard about Carlos Ghosn and his success with Michelin, so he called him and offered to work with him as his deputy at Renault company. Renault was going through one of its worst periods at the time and was even on the verge of bankruptcy. But a year after Carlos Ghosn joined the company, everything changed and it once again started to turn a profit. All of this was made possible by Carlos Ghosn's domineering style. Carlos Ghosn's style, which was literally overwhelming, depended on cutting out any pointless excesses in the company. Carlos Ghosn restructured the company from its roots as an extension of its branches, and the result was the closure of a large number of the company's factories and the dismissal of thousands of workers and employees, so that a group of workers protested in a number of regions and countries where the factories were closed. Carlos Ghosn was once dubbed the cost killer by the French media. The man got a severe, unmerciful method he mainly used to cut off all sources of loss without trying to fix the problems. This way, Carlos managed to get Renault out of its crisis and make it more powerful than ever before. After all of this success, Carlos Ghosn wanted to expand the business and make it a formidable rival to many other automakers like Ford, Toyota, etc., the world's most powerful companies. The idea was to form an alliance with another international company that is well known and has a good reputation around the world. Carlos Ghosn put an eye on Nissan, a Japanese company that, although famous at the time, was passing through a bigger crisis than Renault when Carlos Ghosn took its leadership. Nissan owed $20 billion in debt. Imagine that only 3 of the more than 50 car models it produced were profitable. Renault, under the leadership of Carlos Ghosn, made the offer to purchase a sizable portion of Nissan in an effort to rescue them from their current crisis. This would make Renault the controlling party of Nissan, and as you know, the Japanese are known for their great pride in their identity and industry. Under normal circumstances, it would have been impossible to allow a foreign company like Renault to acquire the largest and controlling stake. Imagine that no Japanese bank would provide Nissan with a loan due to the suffocating crisis the company was facing. Everyone was anticipating its collapse, and everyone knew that lending a helping hand was a little risky. Only Carlos Ghosn and Renault were open to help Nissan. Carlos Ghosn pledged to return the business to its previous state within a year and to have all outstanding debts paid off by the end of 3 years. If not, he will resign and permanently leave the company. Eventually, Nissan accepted the deal, and in 1999, Renault bought up to a 37% share of Nissan. Thereby, it became the dominant party in the Nissan company, and Carlos Ghosn was appointed as the CEO of the Japanese company Nissan, which was extremely weird. Historically, no Japanese company as large as Nissan has ever been headed by a foreign head. Carlos Ghosn visited each of Nissan's factories as soon as he got to Japan. Carlos Ghosn created an integrated strategy to rescue the company from its current predicament, just as he did with Renault. This time, the plan was utterly overwhelming. 5 factories were shut down, workers and employees were fired, and as in the past, the workers staged sizable protests against the loss of their jobs, sparking a massive public campaign against the 2 companies' alliance. It appeared that nothing could stop Carlos Ghosn. He began making decisions that went against the very traditions of Japan. To start, he declared English the company's official language in order to expand globally. Second, Carlos did away with the Japanese-style seniority-based promotion system and replaced it with incentives and promotions that were solely based on profitability. These changes were against the Japanese traditions and customs, which automatically brought many enemies even among the administration members. But these changes would soon prove to be effective. Nissan achieved many achievements and changed completely. Carlos Ghosn made a huge success with Nissan, and as he promised before, the company got back to making huge profits in only 1 year, and Carlos' reputation in Japan changed from a foreign killer to a foreign rescuer. People dubbed him the man with the magic touch, the man who managed to take any company from loss and failure to profit and success. The man's name became more popular not only in Japan but worldwide. His picture and name appeared in the most high-ranked media in the world. He started getting one award after another. They even made a manga about him, and more than 1 million copies of it were sold. The man literally became a star. He was famous and got so much respect, to the point that whenever he entered a restaurant in Japan, people would stand up and applaud. Years passed. Nissan and Renault's numbers kept growing until 2005, when the CEO of Renault retired and his deputy, Carlos Ghosn, became the director of the company. Now, Carlos is the CEO of 2 of the biggest car companies in the world at the same time, which has never happened historically. This put a lot of pressure on Carlos. The majority of his relatives advised him to resign from one of the 2 positions, but he refused and insisted on continuing as the alliance's leader. Carlos Ghosn used to receive an annual salary of up to $17 million. While this amount wasn't high by foreign company CEO standards, it was high by Japanese company standards. For example, Carlos Ghosn's salary was bigger 11 times than the CEO's salary of Toyota, which was the biggest car fabricator in Japan. Can you imagine the amount of envy that many presidents and holders of administrative positions had in Japan? Even on Nissan's board of directors, there were many who had hatred and envy towards him. This hatred will appear later in the events of the story. Carlos Ghosn never failed to live up to his own standards. He threw lavish parties, bought pricey items for his family and himself, owned a yacht worth $10 million, traveled by private jet, drove luxurious and expensive cars, and generally led a lavish lifestyle using the money he earned through his labor. However, such a lifestyle was strange to Japanese customs and traditions. In Japan, they are used to seeing ministers and heads of companies going to work by bike. So imagine their reaction when seeing a foreign director who gets the highest salary showing his fortune in front of everyone. It is normal that Carlos Ghosn has a lot of haters. This hatred will appear at its highest level on November 19. On that day, Carlos Ghosn had a meeting with Nissan's board of directors. He was at the time in Paris, meaning that he would take his private jet and head to Tokyo. Carlos Ghosn said goodbye to his family and wife and got on the plane. As soon as the plane landed in Tokyo, Carlos was surprised by the Japanese police waiting for him at the plane stairway. The plane was surrounded by police cars. They got on the plane and arrested him. Carlos asked about what was happening, and they told him that he was charged with financial corruption. He asked for more details, but nobody got him answers. They took him and put him in jail. The media in Japan and around the world covered the news live. Nissan shares started to fall abruptly while Carlos was in prison and surprised by the situation. He had no idea what was going on outside, but he was waiting for his company, Nissan, to stand by his side and send him a lawyer to get him out. But he would soon be surprised when he knew that the company board of directors appointed one of them as a temporary president, who declared in a press conference that after conducting an internal investigation into the company with the help of the authorities, they found that there was significant administrative and financial corruption caused by CEO Carlos Ghosn, and accordingly decided to remove him from his post immediately. Carlos Ghosn was shocked by what was happening. did not expect treachery and betrayal from the company's board of directors and continued to deny and assert that all the charges against him were false. The main accusation he was charged with was that he didn't declare the money he got from the company. When the money you receive is not declared, you won't pay the right tax for that money. So this was considered tax evasion. Carlos Ghosn's salary was declared to authorities, but the loophole that was used against him was the fact that Carlos had a retirement fund. He was planning to get a large pension after his retirement, and the company administration knew about that. Moreover, the company's board of directors is the one in charge of deciding the amount. The Japanese authorities asked Carlos why he had not declared this money. He told them that the amount had not yet been determined and that he would take it after his retirement. So how could he declare the money he had not yet received? The Japanese authorities were not convinced and told him that this is called financial fraud. Apparently, the whole story seemed weird and fabricated, and what made it weirder was how the authorities treated Carlos Ghosn. Imagine putting him in solitary confinement for 3 months in a tough prison called Kosoki. How is it possible that a person who is not accused of any crime or violence is placed in solitary confinement for 3 months? Nissan's board of directors obviously was leading a defamation campaign against him. They accused him of buying houses and apartments in Paris, Beirut, and Brazil at the expense of the company. But Carlos says that these apartments and houses were known to the company board of directors, and he used them for work because his position as CEO of 2 companies often requires traveling. He also claimed that the ownership of the houses belonged to the company. The second accusation was due to a party he held to celebrate 15 years of the Renault-Nissan alliance, but this party coincided with Carlos's birthday. These parties cost more than $700,000 and were held at the Palace of Versailles in France. The company now wondered whether the party was for the alliance of the 2 companies or for Carlos's birthday. Indeed, Carlos might have thought of combining the 2 parties, but this party was held years ago, and it was public, not a secret conspiracy or money embezzlement. So why did the board of directors not object to it and have not spoken about it until now? It was pretty obvious that the whole thing was an attempt to frame Carlos Ghosn as much as possible. But for what reason? Why did the board of directors turn on Carlos now, after 19 years at the helm of the company? The main reason was that the French government acquired a large stake in Renault, which caused them to fear that the French government would perhaps seek a full merger between the 2 companies, meaning that it wouldn't remain just an alliance. The 2 companies might become one company, which most likely means that Nissan's name would vanish. As it was previously mentioned, the Japanese people had pride and a huge sense of belonging to their identities, so such things were off limits. For them, getting rid of the helm of the company seemed like the best thing to do at that moment. They saw him as the only one who was able to carry out the merger operation smoothly. Indeed, Carlos wanted each company to keep his own identity, but the Japanese saw him as a source of threat, and that was mostly the reason for their reaction and attempts to frame him. Overnight, they turned him from the hero who saved the company into a corrupt villain. Not only in Japan, but even in France, they completely distorted his image in front of people and public opinion. The strange thing here is that the French government is supposed to defend him, but on the contrary, the response from their side was silence, and even the Reynolds company, which he saved while he was its president, did not make any move as if suddenly it had become a global conspiracy against him. During this period, Carlos was still in prison, and the prosecutor's office had no real evidence against him. They were trying to extract a confession from him in any way, so they were constantly investigating him. These interrogation sessions could sometimes stretch for 14 consecutive hours, even without the presence of a lawyer. They even threatened his family and wife. Threatening, isolation in solitary confinement, and pressure in investigations were their methods to get Carlos to confess. Carlos was literally treated as a hostage. However, he remained steadfast and denied all the accusations. When the 3 months were over, the court in Tokyo allowed him to be released on bail, which was 1 billion yen, or $9 million. Of course, Carlos was able to pay bail. He had no other option, so he paid it and got out of prison under a lot of media coverage. The journalists kept following up on his car until he arrived at his apartment. It was nearly impossible to hide his place of residence, and things remained as they were for several weeks. Carlos and his family weren't able to move freely because of the journalists that surrounded the apartment. During this period, Carlos Ghosn was busy preparing for his next move by collecting some information. He tweeted that he was going to hold a press conference on April 11, in which he was going to expose all the facts and uncover the conspiracy hatched against him. Less than 24 hours after the tweet was posted, Japanese authorities surrounded Carlos' apartment and arrested him for a second time. They were scared of letting him reveal all he had experienced in public. Carlos was arrested despite the fact that he paid the bail. However, his lawyers were aware of that, so they took him a video as a plan B in case he got arrested, and that is exactly what happened. After the second arrest, Carlos remained imprisoned for 21 days, then got released on bail for the second time. This time, he paid almost $5 million, meaning he paid a bail of $14 million in total. Imagine that the Japanese authorities had some weird conditions for release. First, they are going to confiscate his Lebanese and Brazilian passports and allow him to only keep the French as an identity document. Second, he is forbidden to leave the country, which is obvious. Third, they are going to confiscate all his personal devices, his laptop and phone. The fourth and strangest condition is that he is forbidden to communicate with his wife and family permanently, meaning that if he tries to send his wife a message or email, he has violated the conditions of release and will be arrested again. It was very clear that the Japanese authorities were trying to weaken Carlos because they knew that his wife was his source of strength, and without her, he would be weaker and could admit it easily. Carlos was sure that Japanese authorities had bad intentions, so he immediately asked his lawyers to tell his wife to go back to Beirut. He wanted to keep his family and the people he loved out of this because he became pretty sure he wouldn't get justice. In Japan, the prosecutor's winning rate in cases in which he is a party was 99.4%. So winning a case against the prosecutor was nearly impossible. So when Carlos felt like his chances of getting a fair trial were slim, he started thinking of escaping from the country. After Carlos' release on bail, he stayed in a house in Japan waiting for his trial, but he was free to move inside the country. The first thing he did to start his escape plan was to get a phone. He paid a large amount of money to get it illegally, a phone that the Japanese authorities don't know about. Carlos used to make all his calls in the bathroom to make sure that no one was spying on him. The question raised here is, who are these people to whom Carlos reached out in order to help him in his escape plan? Those people's identities have never been revealed because this would expose them to danger. Carlos had never talked about them. All we know is that he had a team of 10 to 15 people that helped him plan his escape. First, they thought about escaping through the sea, but the road to Lebanon would take a lot of time. The second way that remained was to escape by air, but the problem, of course, is that Carlos is forbidden to travel. He was forbidden to leave Japan. So how could he get on the plane without being checked by the police? Carlos's team began looking for an airport with fewer safety procedures. They kept traveling from one airport to another. They realized that most airports were tight in terms of security procedures. But they found another airport with a very strong loophole. This airport was in Osaka, and it was small and calm with less traffic. The team observed that in this airport, large boxes, such as those carrying musical instruments, are not subjected to X-ray inspection. The enormous boxes were too large for the airport's X-ray scanners, which were made for small luggage. This prompted the team to think about the crazy idea of smuggling Carlos Ghosn into one of those boxes. The idea was that there would be two guys pretending to be a music band who would come to Tokyo by their private jet, carrying their instruments in those boxes. They would claim to have a concert in Tokyo, and immediately after that, they would have a second concert in Istanbul, which means that their entry and exit from Japan would be quick on the same day. The two guys' identities were revealed later on. The first, named Mike Taylor, was an ex-soldier in the American Special Forces, and the second, named George Zoik, apparently was an ex-soldier too in Lebanon. These are the two guys who would pretend to be musicians to smuggle Carlos Ghosn from Japan. The idea was so crazy that Carlos himself was hesitant at first, but he would sooner realize that he had no other option except to try. The problem was that Carlos's house was under heavy surveillance, and although he was free to move inside Japan, a trip to Osaka would be suspicious. Carlos himself used to spot some people around his house who seemed to be from the Japanese authorities. Carlos asked his lawyer if they had the right to monitor him in this way, and the lawyer replied that they did not have the right to do so, but we could not prove anything against them. Carlos asked his lawyer to find a solution, and the lawyer suggested bringing in some journalists interested in scandals. We'll tell them what's happening so the informants could get confused and stop surveillance. Carlos really reached out to some of the journalists, and when they arrived, Carlos noticed that the informants had vanished immediately, because if they were seen by the journalists, it would be a big scandal for the Japanese authorities. After hours of waiting, the journalists left the place, and shortly after, the informants returned to their places. Carlos saw them in their car or on the street in front of his house. However, Carlos realized that if he wanted them to go, all he had to do was call the journalists, and then they would immediately vanish. Eventually, the smuggling team determined the 29th of December 2019 as the day of carrying out their escape plan. But there was another problem left. Carlos was very famous in Japan, and his foreign features used to attract the attention of people, but fortunately for them, it was the end of the year. It was winter. He wore a large jacket, a winter hat, and put a mask on his face. It was a usual thing for the Japanese to put on a mask, so Carlos was able to hide his face and features with ease. Then he called the journalists and told them that the informants were around his house and they would see them this time. But due to the information that the informants got, they vanished again. As soon as Carlos noticed the disappearance of the informants, he went out wearing his winter clothes to stay unnoticed and headed to a hotel named Grand Hyatt, where he met the two guys that would smuggle him, Mike Taylor and George Zoik, who provided him with a piece of advice so as not to attract attention until they arrived at the airport. They left the hotel, got in a taxi, and headed to the train station, where they took the train to Osaka. After their arrival in Osaka, they went to a hotel where the smuggling box was waiting for them. Carlos tried to get inside the box to make sure that he could breathe normally. They made small holes just in case Carlos found it difficult to breathe. He changed his clothes and then got inside the box. They covered him with a white cloth in case someone opened the box. The two guys asked the hotel staff to take down the box, asking them to use caution because it contained pricey instruments. The box was put into a truck along with another box that was similar, but already carrying musical instruments. The truck headed to the airport. When they arrived, the two guys unloaded the truck and moved towards the customs. Carlos was hearing Japanese words from inside the box. The box kept moving until it stopped, and he then realized that they had reached the customs checking point. Carlos heard one of the two guys talking to a customs employee, telling him that the concert was great, and he thanked them for their cooperation. As we mentioned before, the two guys entered Japan through the same airport and the same customs employees that day morning on the basis that they had a concert in Tokyo, and they were leaving the country after finishing their concert on the same day. The customs, of course, asked about the boxes and what was inside. The two guys told them that there were musical instruments, and the boxes were already checked that day morning when they entered Japan, and now they are taking their instruments after finishing their concert in Tokyo, and they were flying by their private jet to Istanbul for their next concert. One of those guys told the customs that their musical instruments should be handled with caution, otherwise they might be broken. And due to the fact that they had another concert, he asked them not to delay them. The customs employees didn't think twice, as long as the boxes were checked before. No need to check on them again, specifically since the musicians are flying by their private jet. Carlos Ghosn heard two customs employees kidding with each other, and one of them said, "These two guys are most likely smuggling beautiful girls inside the boxes." They didn't check the boxes, and they didn't even try to open them. All that they did was that they put their luggage in the X-ray scanner and let them go. Carlos Ghosn himself said the plan would not have worked without luck. In addition to some circumstances that helped them, such as the timing of the operation, it was the end of the year, and in this exact period the number of employees is less, and many of them are on vacation, and usually the employees present are less experienced, because the most experienced are those who are on vacation. The team went out of the airport with their boxes and loaded them in their private jet. Carlos had to wait for the plane to take off so as to get out the box. He waited for almost half an hour in a state of fear. He was afraid of being exposed. Finally, Carlos heard the sound of the plane and felt its movement on the runway. He was relieved when he was sure that he left Japan. One of the two guys brought the box key and got him out of it, and stayed with him in the back cabinet that was closed. The plane finally landed in Istanbul. A man came and took Carlos to another plane that was waiting for him on the runway without entering the airport. The plane immediately headed to Beirut. The flight was short. It took approximately 1 hour. As soon as Carlos's plane landed in Beirut, the customs officer recognized him. Carlos's name was known in Lebanon, and the Lebanese were supporting him from the beginning of his case. The customs officer welcomed him and congratulated him on his arrival in Lebanon. And here Carlos Ghosn was sure that he had reached safety. Carlos Ghosn returned to his wife and family. And right after that, the news of his escape from Japan has spread widely and all over the world. The authorities and the Japanese media did not accept this, accusing his lawyers of negligence and not monitoring him well, knowing that this was not their mission. Japanese authorities have issued an Interpol arrest warrant for Carlos Ghosn, but Lebanon is not one of the countries that extradite its citizens to any other country. It was clear that they would support Carlos and protect him. Immediately after, Carlos held a big press conference in Beirut in which he explained everything that happened to him to the world and defended himself by exposing details and all the information he got. Eventually, he honestly said that he didn't escape from justice, but he escaped for lack of justice. From that time, Carlos Ghosn appeared in many interviews in most known Arabic and foreign channels. There was also a documentary that discussed all this case's details. The only thing Carlos had reservations about was the escape, because he could have created problems for the people who helped him if he had talked about all the details of the operation. The Lebanese authorities offered that the Japanese authorities hand them over the case files, and Carlos would be tried in the Lebanese court. But the Japanese authorities refused the offer and still asking for Carlos's extradition. Carlos is still living in Lebanon to this day. The case against him is still pending in Japan, and the risk of his arrest remains if he leaves Lebanon because of the arrest warrant submitted by Japan to Interpol. Imagine that even the judicial system in France also issued an arrest warrant for Carlos after some internal investigation at Renault, but ostensibly there is no evidence to prove these charges against Carlos Ghosn. Carlos was always talking about the issue openly, unlike the Japanese system that handled the case with arrogance and always showed its bad intentions. Overall, no one knows the whole truth unless all the cards are exposed one day.